Descartes on sense perception. Rene Descartes is often called the father of modern philosophy. His Meditations on First Philosophy came out in 1641 and 42. It's only about 50 or 60 pages long, but it's one of the greatest works in all philosophy. We're only reading the first meditation, where he calls everything into question. But for the rest of the meditations, he rebuilds all of his knowledge of the world on secure foundations. First, he proves his own existence, then God's existence, and then the external world. I encourage you to pick up the meditations and read the whole thing, because we are only dealing with Descartes as if he were a skeptic, and he isn't really. Now, Descartes starts off by noting that his beliefs, his house of knowledge, his worldview, which he's received since childhood, is really shaky because it's not built on solid foundations. So he decides to wreck it all down to the ground and start fresh. So he engages in opinion demolition, and the first rule he lays down is this: suspend any uncertain beliefs. He says, reason now leads me to think that I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, that means undoubtable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false, from those which I'm sure are false. So that's a really high bar for knowledge. And he doesn't want to just go through each of his beliefs one by one. He wants to start with the most fundamental beliefs on which all the others are based. And nothing's really more fundamental, he thinks, than our trust in our senses. So he says, whatever I have up till now accepted as true, I have acquired either from the senses or through the senses. So the first thing he wants to ask is, do I have any reason to doubt my senses? Are they indubitable? And after some kind of false attempts, he comes up with the dream argument. And he says, there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. And of course, if you're asleep right now and you're dreaming, then none of your sense perceptions are reliable. Now, let me show you how I formalize this argument. First of all, the first premise is just what I said. There are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. Now, Descartes clearly comes to this conclusion that therefore none of my sensory beliefs are certain. Actually, when you go back to the text, he doesn't say that explicitly, it just is kind of obvious. Now, that as it stands is not a valid argument. But remember, we want to charitably reconstruct his argument. And remember my pro tip for filling in unstated premises in order to make an argument valid. Use the modus ponens form. So I can make this valid by creating this conditional premise. If there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep, then none of my sensory beliefs are certain. And now we've got a valid modus ponens argument. The premises may or may not be true, but at least it's valid. Now, Descartes thinks that this is a knockdown argument. So he says, man, there goes all my sensory beliefs. But good news, that still leaves math and geometry. He says, whether I am awake or asleep, 2 and 3 added together are 5, and a square has no more than 5 sides. It seems impossible that such transparent truths should incur any suspicion of being false. That's great. So math and geometry, good to go. But any discipline that depends in any way on observation of material objects, and that includes physics, astronomy, medicine, all of that is doubtful, and therefore he's not going to believe it. He's going to suspend judgment about all of those sciences. But now he comes up with another skeptical worry that applies even to math and geometry. He says, but what if God exists? Now it may sound strange to you to think that the existence of God could be a skeptical worry, but it is. The worry is that an all-powerful being could make Descartes go wrong even in his simplest thoughts, even about arithmetic and geometry. Have you ever made a math mistake? I sure have. Couldn't God make you go wrong in all your math problems, or some kind of similar all-powerful being? Now the obvious reply which Descartes brings up here is this. He says, but perhaps God would not have allowed me to be deceived in this way, since he's said to be supremely good, and a good God wouldn't deceive you all the time. But then Descartes thinks of another objection to himself. He says, if it were inconsistent with God's goodness to have created me such that I am deceived all the time, well, it would seem equally foreign to his goodness to allow me to be deceived even occasionally. Yet this last assertion cannot be made. So here's his argument as I reconstruct it. If there's a non-deceiving God, then I wouldn't make any mistakes at all, it seems like. But I do make at least some mistakes, even in math and geometry, and therefore there's no non-deceiving God. Now notice that that's a modus tollens argument. Okay, so the conclusion here is that if there is a God, that God is a deceiver. So where does that leave us? Well, if there is a God, he's a deceiving God. If a deceiving God exists, then all my beliefs are uncertain, because a deceiving God can make you go wrong about everything. So if there is a God, all my beliefs are uncertain. And that's a hypothetical syllogism. You may be wondering how the second premise is different than the conclusion. The second premise is about a deceiving God, and then the third premise is about, the conclusion is about any God at all. Well, you might think, man, maybe we're better off if there's no God. You know, maybe our beliefs would be more certain if atheism was true. Well, Descartes thinks about that. He says, according to their supposition, the supposition of the atheist, here's how I got here. I have arrived at my present state by fate, or chance, or a continuous chain of events, or by some other means. Yet, since deception and error seem to be imperfections, the less powerful they make my original cause, the more likely it is that I am so imperfect as to be deceived all the time. In other words, he thinks you're no better off if there's no God than if there is a God. Here's the argument that I find in there. First premise, if there is no God, then my original cause is non-theistic. That is, it's fate or chance or some continuous chain of events. But you weren't created by God if there is that. Your original cause wasn't God if there is no God. Second premise, though, if my original cause is non-theistic, all those other kinds of non-theistic causes are weak. They're weak causes, he says. So if there is no God, my original cause is weak. And that follows by hypothetical syllogism. Well, says Descartes, if my original cause is weak, then it is likely that I am so imperfect as to be deceived all the time. The idea here is that if you're just here by chance, or by kind of a blind causal chain, there's no reason that the universe would care to make you a being with reliable faculties. It's just blind luck. So he says, if there is no God, then I'm likely to be so imperfect as to be deceived all the time. Bad news. So we can bring all this together in a constructive dilemma argument, which you may have thought you would never see one of those. But in fact, I think that's what Descartes got here. In fact, two constructive dilemmas built on top of each other. Here's how it goes. If there is a God, he's a deceiver. And if there's no God, then I probably have unreliable mental faculties. That follows from the last two arguments. But either there is a God or there isn't. It's got to be one or the other. So it follows that either I am deceived by God or I have unreliable mental faculties. Premise 4, but if I'm deceived by God, I should suspend all my beliefs, because those are definitely uncertain if there's a deceiving God out there. And if I have unreliable mental faculties, again, I should suspend all my beliefs. So either way, I should suspend all my beliefs. None of them are certain. None of them are indubitable. And that is the black hole that Descartes has dug himself into at the end of the first meditation.